Hello, everyone. I'm Reena, the Education Director here at ACDC, and I'm so glad you are joining us today. So, this is a webinar on study smarter, not longer. So, we'll talk about a lot of study techniques here that will help the students at high school, middle school, or at the college level. So, let's start with a simple question. How many of you have spent hours studying only to walk into a test and feel your brain completely freeze? Or maybe you felt totally confident during class, but a week later, it's completely gone. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. And more importantly, it doesn't mean you're bad at school. Most students are not struggling because they lack capability. They are struggling because nobody ever explicitly taught them how human memory actually functions. Instead, we are conditioned to believe that studying means rereading notes, highlighting pages, and pulling all-nighters. These habits, they create a dangerous illusion of competence because the material looks familiar, but familiarity is not mastery. So today we are shifting paradigm. The single biggest insight I want you to hold on to throughout this webinar is this: the brain remembers through retrieval, not repetition. True learning does not happen because you looked at a textbook the longest or highlighted the most pages. It happens when you force your brain to independently pull that information out of memory. So let's formally start with that. So just give me a moment and let me just share my slides here with you. So it's going to be a very interesting session today because we will discuss a lot of strategies today. So here we are. Great. So we will start with our agenda for the day today. So the key pillars that we will be discussing today, they are shifting the study mindset. We'll talk about a lot of strategies like active recall, spaced practice, Cornell Notes, digital tools, and building a realistic study routine for you. So let's get started. Now, the first strategy that we will discuss is active recall. Now, active recall is an evidence-based learning strategy that strengthens long-term retention through the intentional retrieval of information. So to simply put, active recall means intentionally forcing yourself to retrieve information from memory instead of just rereading it. Now, rather than passively reviewing material through rereading or highlighting, active recall requires the learner to actively generate, explain, or apply information without immediately relying on notes or external support. Now, this process, it strengthens neural pathway associated with memory and comprehension, making information easier to retain and retrieve over time. Now, active recall shifts learning from simple recognition to true understanding and retention, which is why it is considered one of the most effective evidence-based study techniques. Now, think of your brain like a muscle. You can't build physical strength just by watching workout videos. You have to lift the weights. Studying works exact the same way. When we just reread notes or highlight text, we fall into the I know it trap. The information looks familiar, so we assume we have learned it until the exam hits and we realize we can't actually explain it. That's the difference between recognition and retrieval. Recognition is passive exposure, and retrieval is the heavy lifting. So, to truly retain information, we have to force our brain to independently pull it out of memory through active habits like self testing and solving problems without looking. Some practical strategies include here are brain dump, flashcards, teaching. Now, let's first talk about the brain dump. Brain dump is the ultimate, I will say, antidote to passive reading. After you finish a lecture or a chapter, close your laptop, hide your books, and grab a blank sheet of paper. Write down absolutely everything you can remember. No filtering, no neatness, just clear out your brain. Once you are done, open your resources and look for the gaps. What did you miss? What did you get wrong? That is exactly where your studying needs to focus. The second method is active flashcards. Now, flashcards are incredible, but only if you use them honestly. The biggest mistake students make it looking at the front of a card, guessing vaguely, and flipping it over and saying, oh, yeah, I knew it. Now, this is a lie your brain tells you to feel safe. To make them work, you must commit to your answer. Write it down, say it loud, or type it out before you flip the card. Then we have Feynman technique, that is teaching. The absolutely gold standard of mastery is teaching. Find a friend, a classmate, or even an empty room, and explain the concept out loud from memory. Now, the moment your mouth opens, you will instantly realize where your understanding cracks. If you stumble, it means you don't own that knowledge yet. Now, a common misconception is that active recall is only for shallow memorization, like learning dates in history or vocabulary word. But the truth is, retrieval is your most powerful tool for deep conceptual mastery. To move beyond just remembering and into understanding, you need to ask your brain better questions. I want you to look at these 4 power questions as your diagnostic tool for mastery. Why does this matter? Stop learning facts in isolation, it means. So when you force your brain to find the significance and context of a concept, it instantly prioritizes it for long-term storage. The second powerful question is, how does this connect? We all know knowledge needs a home. Ask yourself, how does this relate to last week's lesson? You're building mental bridges here. The more bridges you build to a fact, the easier is it to find during an exam. The third powerful question is, what if this changed? Test the mechanics with hypothetical scenarios. What if this variable doubled? What if this rule did not apply? If you understand how a concept breaks, you truly understand how it works. The fourth powerful question is, can I explain this to a 10-year-old? Now, this is the ultimate test of clarity, I would say. If you can't explain a complex idea without hiding behind academic jargon, you don't fully grasp it yet. So, stripping away the big words reveals the truth, I would say. Let's explore another most common study habit students rely on, and that's cramming. So let's see what's that. Now, in cognitive psychology, cramming is referred to a massed practice. It's a practice of concentrating study or practice sessions into a single intensive block of time, immediately preceding an assessment, relying heavily on working memory rather than long term memory and coding. So many students cram because it creates the feeling of productivity and urgency. However, the brain does not learn best under panic and overload. Cramming often creates short term familiarity rather than stable long term understanding. So, in many ways, cramming becomes a survival strategy instead of a true learning strategy. Cramming happens when students attempt to learn large amounts of information in a very short period of time, usually right before an exam, quiz, or deadline. Now, while this approach may sometimes help students temporarily remember information, it often leads to stress, mental fatigue, and week long term retention. Actually, this cramming habit, it often creates what we call disposable learning. And disposable learning is information that stays in the brain just long enough to get through the test and then quickly just disappears afterward. Students may feel temporarily prepared because the information is fresh in short term memory. But without repeated retrieval and review, the brain does not hold on to it for long term use. This is why many students experience the feeling of forgetting material only days after an exam. The brain was focused on short term survival rather than building long lasting memory pathways. So, true learning is not about memorizing information long enough to pass a test. It is about creating understanding that can be recalled, applied, and connected over time. So, this is a very interesting graph that shows us why memory weakens naturally. So, our brains are naturally designed to forget information that is not revisited, or I would say that is not used. Now, this process is completely normal and is part of how the brain organizes and prioritizes information. Now, without retrieval and review, memory pathways begin to weaken over time. This is why students often feel like they understood something during class, but cannot remember it days or weeks later. Now, let's take a look at this graph. Now, at this graph, we can notice that how the line slopes downward over time. Now, this represents how memory naturally decreases when information is not revisited or actively retrieved. Now, right after learning something new, our memory is usually very strong. However, as time passes, we can see that as a time passes, without review or practice, the brain begins weakening those memory pathways. The brain essentially assumes the information is not important enough to keep easily accessible. Now, this downward slope is known as the forgetting curve. It helps explain why students may feel confident immediately after studying, but struggle to remember the material days or weeks later. Now, the important takeaway is that forgetting is normal. The goal is not to avoid forgetting completely, but to interrupt the forgetting process through spaced review or active recall. Every time we revisit information, the curve begins to flatten and memory becomes stronger and more stable over time. So memory strengthens through repeated retrieval and spaced review over time. Let's look at how your study schedule impacts your brain state. When you cram, you force your brain into survival mode. Your brain treats that last minute panic as an emergency situation, flooding your system with stress. Now, this actually takes your prefrontal cortex offline. The prefrontal cortex is that area of the brain responsible for critical thinking and complex problem solving. So it becomes offline. You might recall just enough to survive tomorrow's exam, but that knowledge disappears immediately afterward. Now, in contrast, spaced practice unlocks thriving mode. By revisiting information gradually over time, your brain stays calm, focused, and secure. Instead of overwhelming your neural networks in a single night, spaced retrieval trains the mental muscle consistently. So cramming is about short-term survival, and spaced practice is about true cognitive growth and lasting memory. So to build durable knowledge that actually lasts, our brain relies on three critical phases: repeated exposure, neural strengthening, and long-term locking. So let's talk about all these three one by one. Repeated exposure. A single exposure only creates temporary familiarity. The brain needs multiple opportunities to encounter information over time before it signals to the subconscious that this data is important enough to preserve. Second is neural strengthening. Okay, think of each review session as a workout for your synapse. Synapses are the connections between the different parts of the brain. Every time information is revisited and retrieved, that specific neural pathway is reactivated. And this physical repetition makes the biological pathway thicker, faster, and incredibly resistant to forgetting. And the third is long-term locking. Now, this is where spaced intervals do their magic. Instead of relying on a fragile short-term memorization buffer that clears out overnight, spaced practice gradually moves information out of temporary storage and locks it into your brain's permanent long-term memory bank. So here are the three, I would say, the critical phases to build a durable knowledge. Interesting rule, and I love this rule. So one effective strategy supported by cognitive science is the 1-3-7-14 rule for spaced practice. Now, the idea is simple. Instead of studying information only once, students revisit the material at increasing intervals over time. The first review happens after day 1, then again after 3 days, then after 7 days, and then again after 14 days. So each review strengthens the brain's ability to retrieve the information. Rather than allowing the memory to fade completely, the brain is reminded of the content right as it begins weakening. Now, this repeated retrieval, it strengthens neural connections and improves long-term retention. So the 3-1-3-7-14 rule also reduces cognitive overload and stress. Instead of overwhelming the brain in a single high pressure session, learning becomes gradual here, manageable, and neurologically aligned with how memory is naturally strengthened. I love this rule, and I have used that a lot when I was a student. So this approach is especially valuable when preparing for cumulative and high stakes exams such as SAT, ACT, MCAT, or licensing exams. Now, these tests are not designed to measure what a student memorized the night before. They measure how well knowledge has been retained, connected, and applied over time. So, in many ways, spaced practice shifts studying from a short term survival into long term mastery. So, we have understood that consistent study habits are far more effective than cramming. The brain grows stronger through regular repeated exposure over time. Small, consistent study sessions, they allow the brain to absorb, organize, and strengthen information gradually. This is where Cornell Notes became very powerful, especially powerful. Now, Cornell Notes naturally support spaced practice because they're designed for repeated interaction with information rather than passive note taking. There are three characteristics: active interactivity, low intensity, high consistency, and pathway strengthening. Active interactivity. So Cornell Notes involve active summarizing, questioning, cue reviewing, and self-testing. This strengthens the neural pathway connected to the learning, making the memory more durable and easier to access later. Low intensity, high consistency. Now, instead of overwhelming the brain in one intense session, Cornell Notes prevents cognitive overload by encouraging students to revisit material multiple times in short bursts. Pathway strengthening. This process moves information beyond temporary memorization into long term retention. Cornell Notes are not just an organization tool, they're designed to align with how memory naturally grows and strengthens over time. The Cornell Note system follows a simple but highly effective blueprint that supports attention, understanding, and long-term retention. There are three main sections here: main notes, Q column, or we can call it as Q questions also. And the third section is summary. We will discuss each of the section in detail. The first section is the main notes area. This is where students record the key ideas, concepts, critical explanations, and examples presented during the lecture or study session. The goal is not to write every single word, but to actively listen and identify the most important information. Because students must filter and organize information in real time, the brain becomes more engaged during the learning process. This active processing strengthens immediate understanding and attention. Most importantly, students should focus on capturing the relationships between ideas. For example, how does one concept connect to another? What causes a certain outcome? Um, what patterns or themes are emerging, what is the larger concept being explained. So these are some of the questions that you can use to organize the main notes. The second section is the Q column or Q question. Now, the Q column is where information begins transforming from passive notes into active learning. In this section, students do not simply label topics or rewrite headings. Instead, they convert information into meaningful questions. For example, rather than writing photosynthesis definition, a stronger cue would be, what is the purpose of photosynthesis? Now, this small shift changes how the brain interacts with the material. Questions naturally activate curiosity, retrieval, and deeper thinking. The brain is no longer just recognizing information here. It is preparing to recall and explain it. Now, the final section here is summary. The summary section is where learning becomes synthesis. At the end of the page, students should apply what can be called the 30-second rule. The goal is to summarize the entire page as if explaining to a friend in just 30 seconds. This forces the brain to simplify, organize, and identify what truly matters. So instead of repeating every detail, students must prioritize the most critical concepts from the lecture or study session. They begin asking, what were the main ideas? What concepts appeared repeatedly? What information is most essential to remember? So together, the Cornell Notes structure transforms note-taking from a passive activity into an active learning system. Students are not simply recording information here. They're processing it, organizing it, retrieving it, and reinforcing it in ways that align with how the brain naturally learns best. This is an example of how we can take the Cornell Notes. So as we can see, this is the main notes area. Then we have here the Q column, and that's where the summary goes in here. Study has evolved way beyond paper notes and heavy textbooks. Digital tools have completely transformed how we organize and review information. But studying smarter isn't about using more technology. It's about using it intentionally. The most powerful digital tools are the ones that align with how the brain naturally learns best by supporting organization, retrieval practice, and spaced intervals. So when used correctly, these tools reduce cognitive load, build efficiency, and turn studying from a chaotic last-minute survival tactic into a structured system for long-term mastery. So the goal is not to work harder. It's to combine brain-based strategy with technology to build consistency, reflection, and true active recall. So we will discuss some high-impact power tools here. Digital study tools are most effective when they are paired with how the brain naturally learns through repetition, retrieval, organization, and active engagement. Each of these platforms serves a different purpose, but together they can create a powerful learning system. Anki is often considered the gold standard for automated spaced repetition. It is spatially effective for subjects that require heavy memorization, such as anatomy, vocabulary, formulas, languages, or medical terminology. Now, Anki automatically schedules review sessions based on how well a student remembers each card. ensuring information is revisited right before it is likely to be forgotten. This aligns directly with the brain's forgetting curve that we just discussed and helps strengthen long term retention through repeated retrieval over time. Then we have RemNote. Now, RemNote combines deep note taking with built in active recall. Instead of separating notes from studying, RemNote turns the notes themselves into review questions and flashcards automatically. This means students are constantly interacting with the material instead of passively rereading it. In many ways, the notes become the test. This strengthens comprehension because students are repeatedly challenged to retrieve and explain information from memory. Now, the next is Notion. Notion serves as a powerful organizational hub. While it is not primarily a memorization tool, it excels at managing the structure of learning. Students can organize syllabus, assignments, calendars, study schedules, lecture notes, and project timelines all in one place. Now, this reduces mental clutter and cognitive overload by helping students visually organize priorities and responsibilities. Notion supports the planning side of academic success, which is often just as important as studying itself. Then the next is Quizlet. Quizlet is often one of the most accessible entry points into active studying. Its user-friendly format makes it especially effective for vocabulary practice, concept review, matching activities, and group study sessions. Students can quickly create flashcards, quizzes, games that encourage retrieval practice in an engaged way. For many students, Quizlet becomes the first step away from passive rereading and toward active recall-based learning. Now, the goal of these tools is not simply convenience. Their real value comes from supporting brain-based learning strategies, such as spaced repetition, retrieval practice, organization, and active engagement. So technology alone does not create learning. Intentional use of technology, it does. One of the hidden roadblocks in modern studying is falling into the productivity trap. We get so obsessed with creating the perfect setup, customizing templates, color coding files, and building intricate dashboards that we mistake static organization of actual learning. This is fake work. If you spend 2 hours tweaking your planner but 0 minutes retrieving facts from memory, no real learning happened. Organization supports learning, but organization itself is not learning. This obsession leads directly to app fatigue. Now, juggling 5 different apps and maintaining complex workflows is cognitively exhausting. When you spend all your mental energy managing notifications and switching between platforms, you drain the exact cognitive fuel your brain needs for active recall and deep focus. Eventually, the system becomes a burden. A truly effective study system should reduce friction, not create it. Simplicity is the ultimate strategy here. The best system is a sustainable one that keeps your brain's energy focused entirely on what matters most. That is learning, understanding, and remembering. To break out the productivity trap, we use minimalist framework called the 1+1 strategy. Instead of juggling a massive digital tech stack, you simplify your entire academic workflow into exactly 2 essential categories. First one is organization tool, And then we have a review tool. So first choose one organization tool. This serves as your single source of truth to track deadlines, schedules, and assignments. Whether you prefer Notion, Google Calendar, or a simple planner, the rule is strict: one reliable location. This instantly clears mental clutter and cuts down on the friction of constantly searching for your materials. Second, choose one review tool. This tool is dedicated strictly to high performance cognitive work, that is, active recall and spaced repetition. Platforms like Anki or RemNote are perfect examples because they are built purely to challenge your brain to retrieve information over time. The core takeaway here is that this is enough. A lean study stack is a fast study stack. By stripping away unnecessary digital complexity, you stop wasting energy on the tools themselves and start investing it entirely into building reliable, consistent learning habits. Analog edge. The ultimate takeaway when building your study stack is a simple truth: habit beats tech. A student with nothing more than a wooden pencil, a piece of paper, and a disciplined routine, like 1-3-7-14 rule, will always outperform a student who has the most expensive apps but zero structured discipline. This is what we call the analog edge. Think of technology as a multiplier, not a substitute for effort. If your baseline study habit is strong, technology will amplify your efficiency. But if your baseline habit is zero, technology simply multiplies that zero. The brain doesn't care whether information is hosted on an advanced digital dashboard or a handwritten notebook. It only cares about active engagement. In fact, writing by hand forces you to slow down, digest, and summarize information rather than just copying and pasting it. So at the end of the day, apps are just tools and systems are just strategies. Your habits are what create results. To bring everything together, let's establish 4 fundamental principles for designing your digital study environment: function over form, aggressive simplification, protect deep work, realistic maintenance. So, function over form. Choose tools based on learning science, not aesthetics. A visually beautiful dashboard is completely useless if it does not actually support active retrieval or spaced intervals. Always ask yourself, does this tool help me remember and retrieve information more effectively? Aggressive simplification. If a tool requires constant tweaking, redesigning, or more than 10 minutes of maintenance a week, it is creating friction rather than adding value. Remember, your goal is to learn the material, not to maintain the software. Third is protect deep work. Modern technology introduces endless digital distractions. Sometimes the most effective way to use technology is to block other technology. Use apps like Forest or Freedom to secure uninterrupted focus blocks so your brain can actually process complex concepts. And the last is realistic maintenance. The single best system is not the most advanced one. It's the one you can realistically maintain day after day. Overly complex workflows may feel exciting during the first week, but if they become exhausting, you will abandon them. Build your system on a foundation of clear structure, minimal friction, and a focus on cognitive habits, then support long-term mastery. Now, to truly change our results, we have to finish by completely reframing how we measure study success. It requires two major shifts in mindset. First, effort versus impact. Second is mastery versus familiarity. So, first, effort versus impact. Studying is often misunderstood as a measure of pure endurance. We tend to celebrate the student who sits at a desk the longest or sacrifices the most sleep. But learning isn't about who suffered the longest. Two highly focused hours utilizing active recall and spaced repetition will always generate a greater cognitive impact than 6 exhausting hours of passive rereading. The second is mastery versus familiarity. Rereading notes or highlighting text makes information feel familiar. It creates a dangerous illusion of competence because the material looks recognizable, it looks familiar. But recognition is not mastery. Mastery means your brain can independently retrieve, explain, and apply a concept without looking at a single prompt. It's time to stop rewarding ourselves simply for hours locked at a desk. True efficiency isn't laziness. It is the ultimate goal because it aligns with how our brain naturally flourish. So let's shift our focus away from just performing the act of studying and start measuring the actual knowledge we built. I would like to share with you this interesting graph on consistency and intensity. This graph perfectly illustrates a fundamental truth about high performance learning. Mastery is built through consistency, not intensity. Now, most students rely on intensity. They wait until the last minute and launch into exhausting study marathons. On our graph, this is represented by that sharp, isolated peak labeled stress peak. Now, these intense bursts feel incredibly productive because they create a temporary spike in focus, but they are completely unsustainable and rapidly drop out. Now, real mastery looks entirely different. Look at the dotted red line here. That represents steady, repeated progress over time. At first, this baseline growth feels painfully slow, as we can see here, but small daily rhythm gradually compounds. Because of that consistent retrieval and spacing, look at what happens next. The yellow mastery curve suddenly shoots up, strengthening exponentially. So ultimately, the brain responds to rhythm over intensity. Consistency lowers your stress and reduces cognitive overload because it aligns with how your memory naturally consolidates. So true academic success isn't about pulling off one dramatic high pressure breakthrough. It's simply about showing up consistently enough to let your cognitive growth compound. So to bring our discussion to a close, let's look back at the 4 pillars of effective learning we covered today. Active recall, spaced practice, where we talked about the rule 13714, the Cornell Notes system, and the digital intent. So ultimately, the core message of this program is simple. You do not need more study time. You need study methods that align with how the human brain naturally learns. When you leave a presentation like this, it is easy to feel highly motivated and want to change everything overnight, your calendar, your notes, and all your apps. But radical change is rarely sustainable. The real progress happens through small, consistent adjustments, um, repeated over time. Instead of trying to implement every strategy at once, pick just one core technique to commit to for this upcoming week. So swap passive reading for active recall, track your review schedule using the 13714 system, set up a Cornell Notes template for just one class, or clean house and simplify your app stack. The goal here is consistency, not perfection. So small habits repeatedly, daily build much stronger neural pathways than short, intense bursts of temporary motivation. Start small, lock in the routine first, and let your system grow organically from there. So, as you move forward from today, your goal isn't to reinvent your entire academic life overnight. Instead, start tomorrow by choosing just one simple, intentional action item from this checklist. Replace rereading with self testing, replace cramming with shorter spaced intervals, transform your notes into questions, Cornell method, audit your digital tools, keep only what serves your memory. All right, so here we go. Thank you so much. So, thank you so much for being here today. And I really hope that these strategies help you study with more confidence, less stress, and stronger long term success.